Hello, welcome to the third hour of Bedtime with Bruce. I am your host, Bruce. We are in the third hour, which means we're in the homoerotic portion of the show. We started reading the book, The House of the Vampire, and this is by George Sylvester Viereck. It's an early 20th century vampire story. It was first published in 1907. It is one of the first gay vampire stories, and so this was one of the beginnings of that whole genre. The vampires in here are not only blood-drinking vampires, but they're psychic vampires, so this is more of a mental thing. I'm going to be honest, I really don't have a great idea of what's going on, if I'm being honest, but we have committed here at Bedtime with Bruce to finish every book we start, so we're going to see it through to the end. I'm hoping it picks up a little bit. I'm open to that. So let's jump in and start chapter 10 and see where it goes. Let's begin. Oh, I'm sorry. Before I begin, I got to say, I'm actually going to read this book on my e-reader. I'm going to do that once a night. There is actually a link if you're joining us at bedtimewithbruce.com. There's a link down underneath me somewhere that will direct you to a Kindle if you've ever been interested in getting one at Amazon. So if you're feeling like that, check them out. I'm having a lot of fun with this. It's working great for me. There's a lot of features that I haven't figured out yet, but my producer's helping me with that, so it's kind of cool. Technology. Okay, let's jump into chapter 10 now. That night, a brilliant crowd had gathered in Reginald Clark's house. From the studio and the adjoining salon arose a continual murmur of well-tuned voices. On bare white throats jewels shone, as if in each a soul were imprisoned, and voluptuously rustled the silk that clung to the fair slim forms of its bearers in an undulating caress. Subtle perfumes emanated from the hair and hands of siren women, commingling with the soft, plump scent of their flesh. Fragrant tapers, burning in precious crystal globules, stained with exquisite colors, sprinkled their shimmering light over the fashionable assemblage, and lent a false radiance to the faces of the men, while in the hair and jewels of the women each ray seemed to dance like an imp with its mate. A seat like a throne, covered with furs of tropic beasts of prey, stood in one corner of the room, in the full glare of the light, waiting for the monarch to come. Above were arranged with artistic refinement weird oriental draperies, resembling a crimson canopy in the total effect. Chattering visitors were standing in groups or had seated themselves on the divans and curiously fashioned chairs that were scattered in seeming disorder throughout the salon. There were critics and writers and men of the world. Everybody who was everybody and a little bigger than somebody else was holding court in his own small circle of enthusiastic admirers. The bohemian element was subdued, but not entirely lacking. The magic of Reginald Clark's name made stately dames blind to the presence of some individuals whom they would have passed on the street without recognition. Ernest surveyed this gorgeous assembly with the absent look of a sleepwalker. Not that his sensuous soul was unsusceptible to the atmosphere of culture and corruption that permeated the whole, nor the dazzling color effects that tantalized while they delighted the eye. But tonight they shriveled into insignificance before the splendor of his inner vision. A radiant dreamland palace, his play, had risen from the right of inchoate thought. It was wonderful, it was real, and needed for its completion only the detail of actual construction, and now the characters were hovering in the recesses of his brain, where yearning to leave that many-winded labyrinth to become beings of paper and ink. He probably would have tarried overlong in this fanciful mansion had not the reappearance of an unexpected guest broken his reverie. "Jack!" he exclaimed in surprise. "I thought you 100 miles from here." "That shows that you no longer care for me," Jack playfully answered. "When our friendship was young, you always had a presentiment of my presence." "Ah, perhaps I had. But tell me, where do you hail from?" "Clark called me up on the telephone, long distance, you know. I suppose it was meant as a surprise for you, and you certainly look surprised, not even pleasantly. I am really head over heels at work, but you know how it is. Sometimes a little imp whispers into my ears, daring me to do a thing which I know is foolish. But what of it? My legs are strong enough not to permit my follies to overtake me." "It was certainly good of you to come. In fact, you make me very glad. I feel that I need you tonight. I don't know why. The feeling came suddenly as you. I only know I need you. How long can you stay?" "I must leave you tomorrow morning. I have to hustle somewhat. You know my examinations are taking place in a day or two, and I've got to cram up a lot of things." "Still," remarked Ernest, "your visit will repay you for the loss of time. Clark will read to us tonight his masterpiece." "What is it?" "I don't know. I only know it's the real thing. It's worth all the wisdom bald-headed professors may administer to you in concentrated doses at 5,000 a year." Come now, Jack," could not help saying. "Is your memory giving way? Don't you remember your own days in college, especially the mathematical examinations? You know that your marks always came pretty clear to the absolute zero." "Jack," said Ernest in honest indignation, "not the last time. The last time I didn't flunk." "No, because your sonnet on Cartesian geometry aroused even the math fiend to compassion. And don't you remember Professor Squealer, whose heart seemed to leap with delight whenever he could tell you that in spite of your incessant toil, he had again flunked you in physics with 59.5%? And he wouldn't raise the mark to 60. God forgive him. I cannot." Here their exchange of reminiscences was interrupted. There was a stir. The little potentates of conversation hastened to their seats before their minions had deserted them. The king was moving to his throne. Assuredly, Reginald Clark had the bearing of a king. Leisurely he took his seat under the canopy. A hush fell in the audience. Not a fan stirred as he slowly unfolded his manuscript. The music of Reginald Clark's intonation captivated every ear. The music of Reginald Clark's intonation captivated every ear. Voluptuously, in measured cadence, it rose and fell, now full and strong like the sound of an organ, now soft and clear like the tinkling of bells. His voice detracted by its very tunefulness from what he said. The powerful spell charmed over even Ernest's accustomed ear. The first page gracefully glided from Reginald's hand to the carpet before the boy dimly realized that he was intimately familiar with every word that fell from Reginald's lips. When the second page slipped with seeming carelessness from the reader's hand, a sudden shudder ran through the boy's frame. It was as if an icy hand had gripped his heart. There could be no doubt of it. This was more than a mere coincidence. It was plagiarism. He wanted to cry out, but the room swam before his eyes. Surely he must be dreaming. It was a dream. The faces of the audience, the lights, Reginald, Jack, all phantasmagoria of a dream. Perhaps he had been ill for a long time. Perhaps Clark was reading the play for him. He did not remember having written it, but he probably had fallen sick after its completion. What strange pranks our memories will play on us. But no, he was not dreaming, and he had not been ill. He could endure the horrible uncertainty no longer. His overstrung nerves must find relaxation in some way or break with a twang. He turned to his friend who was listening with rapt attention. "Jack! Jack!" he whispered. "What is it?" "That is my play." "You mean that you inspired it?" "No! I have written it, or rather was going to write it." "Wake up, Ernest. You are mad." "No, in all seriousness. It is mine. I told you. Don't you remember when we returned from Coney Island that I was writing a play?" "Ah, but not this play." "Yes, this is the play I conceived. I practically wrote it." The more's the pity that Clark had preconceived it. "But it is mine." "Did you tell him a word about it?" No, to be sure. Did you leave the manuscript in your room? I had, in fact, not written a line of it. No, I had not begun the actual writing. Why should a man of Clark's reputation plagiarize your plays, written or unwritten? I can see no reason, but tut-tut. For already this whispered conversation had elicited a look like a stab from a lady before them. Ernest held fast to the edge of a chair. He must cling to some reality, or else drift rudderless in a dim sea of vague apprehensions. Or was Jack right? Was his mind giving away? No, no, no! There must be a monstrous secret somewhere. But what matter? Did anything matter? He had called on his mate like a ship lost in the fog. For the first time he had not responded. He had not understood. The bitterness of tears rose to the boy's eyes. Above it all, melodiously, ebbed and flowed the rich accents of Reginald Clark. Ernest listened to the words of his own play coming from the older man's mouth. The horrible fascination of the scene held him entranced. He saw creations of his mind pass in review before him, as a man might look on the face of his double, grinning at him from behind a door in the hideous hours of night. They were all here, the mad king, the subtle-witted courtiers, the somber-hearted prince, the queen mother who had loved a jester better than her royal mate, and the fruit of their shameful alliance, the Princess Marigold, a creature woven of sunshine and sin. Swiftly the action progressed. Shadows of impending death darkened the house of the king. In the horrible agony of the rack, the old jester confessed. Stripped of his cap and bells, crowned with a wreath of blood, he looked so pathetically funny that Princess Marigold could not help laughing between her tears. The queen stood there, all trembling and pale. Without a complaint, she saw her lover die. The executioner's sword smote the old man's head, straight from the trunk. It rolled at the feet of the king, who tossed it to Marigold. The little princess kissed it, and covered the grinning horror with her yellow veil. The last words died away. There was no applause, only silence. All were stricken with the dread that men feel in the house of God, or his awful presence in genius. But the boy lay back in the chair. The cold sweat had gathered on his brow, and his temples throbbed. Nature had mercifully clogged his head with blood. The rush of it drowned the crying voice of the nerves, deadening for a while both consciousness and pain. Okay, chapter 12. Let me get some tea. Okay, so here we go. Somehow the night had passed. Somehow in bitterness and anguish, but it had passed. Ernest's lips were parched, and sleeplessness had left its trace in the black rings under the eyes when in the next morning he confronted Reginald in the studio. Reginald was sitting at the writing table in his most characteristic pose, supporting his head with his hand and looking with clear, piercing eyes searchingly at the boy. Yes, he observed, it's a most curious physical phenomenon. You cannot imagine how real it all seemed to me. The boy spoke painfully dazed, as if struck by a blow. Even now, it is as if something has gone from me, some struggling thought that I cannot remember. Reginald regarded him as a physical experimenter might look upon the subject of a particularly baffling mental disease. You must not think, my boy, that I bear you any malice for your extraordinary delusion. Before Jack went away, he gave me an exact account of all that had happened. Divers incidents recurred to him from which it appears that, at various times in the past, you have been on the verge of a nervous collapse. A nervous collapse? What was the use of this term but a euphemism for insanity? Do not despair, dear child, Reginald caressingly remarked. Your disorder is not hopeless, not incurable. Such crises come to every man who writes. It is a tribute we pay to the lords of song. The many singer of the past wrote with his heart's blood, but we moderns dip our pen into the sap of our nerves. We analyze life, love, art, and the dissecting knife that we use on other men's souls finally turns against ourselves. But what shall a man do? Shall he sacrifice art to hygiene and surrender, the one attribute that makes him chiefest of created things? Animals, too, think. Some walk on two legs. But introspection differentiates man from the rest. Shall we yield up the sweet consciousness of self that we derive from the analysis of our emotion for the contentment of the bull that ruminates in the shade of the tree, the healthful stupidity of a mule? Assuredly not. But what shall a man do? Ah, that I cannot tell. Mathematics often offers definite solutions that admit of a definite solution. I'm sorry. Ah, that I cannot tell. Mathematics often offers definite problems that admit of a definite solution. Life states its problems with less exactness and offers for each a different solution. 1 and 2 are 2. 1 and 1 are 2 today and tomorrow. Physical values on each manipulation will yield a different result. Still, your case is quite clear. You have overworked yourself in the past, mentally and emotionally. You have sown unrest and must not be surprised if neurasthenia is the harvest thereof. Do you think I should go to some sanitarium? The boy asked falteringly. God forbid. Go to the seashore, somewhere where you can sleep and play. Take your body along, but leave your brain behind. At least do not take more of it with you than is necessary. The summer season in Atlantic City has just begun. There, as everywhere in American society, you will be much more welcome if you come without brains. Reginald's half-bantering tone reassured Ernest a little. Timidly he dared approach one more the strange event that had wrought such havoc with his nervous equilibrium. How do you account for my strange obsession? One might almost call it a mania. If it could be accounted for, it would not be strange. Can you suggest no possible explanation? Perhaps a stray leaf on my desk, a few indications of the plot, a remark, who knows? Perhaps thought matter is floating in the air. Perhaps. But we had better not talk of it now. It would needlessly excite you. You are right, answered Ernest gloomily. Let us not talk of it. But whatever may be said, it is a marvelous play. You flatter me. There is nothing in it that you may not be able to do equally well someday. Ah, no, the boy replied, looking up to Reginald with admiration. You are the master. All right, that ended chapter 11. We are now on to chapter 13. Lazily, Ernest stretched his limbs on the beach of Atlantic City. The sea, that purger of 6 souls, had washed away the fever and the fret of the last few days. The wind was in his hair, and the spray was in his breath, while the rays of the sun kissed his bare arms and legs. He rolled over in the glittering sand in the sheer joy of living. Now and then a wavelet stole far into the beach as if to caress him, but pined away ere it could reach its goal. It was as if the enamored sea was reaching out its arms to him. Who knows, perhaps, through the clear water, some green-eyed nymph or a young sea god with the tang of the sea in his hair was peering amorously at the boy's red mouth. The people of the deep love the red warm blood of humankind. It is always the young they lure into their watery haunts, never the shriveled limbs that totter shivering to the grave. Such fancies came to Ernest as he lay on the shore in his bathing attire, happy, thoughtless animals. The sun and the sea seemed to him two lovers vying for his favor. The sudden change of environment had brought complete relaxation and had quieted his rebellious, assertive soul. He was no longer a solitary unit, but one with wind and water, herb and beach and shell. Almost voluptuously his hand toyed with the hot sand that glided, caressing through his fingers and buried his breast and shoulders under its glittering burden. A summer girl who passed lowered her eyes coquettishly. He watched her without stirring. Even to open his mouth or smile would have seemed too much exertion. Thus he lay for hours, When at length noon drew nigh, it cost him a great deal of effort of will to shake off his drowsy mood and exchange his airy costume for the conventional habiliments of the dining room. Habiliments. He had taken lodgings in a fashionable hotel. An unusual stroke of good luck, hack work that had paid outrageously well, had made it possible for him to idle for a time without a thought of the unpleasant necessity of making money. One single article to which he signed his name, only with a reluctance, had brought to him more gear than a series of gold sonnets. Surely, he thought, the social revolution ought to begin from above. What right has the bricklayer to grumble when he receives for a week's work almost more than I for a song? Thus, soliloquizing, he reached the dining room. The scene that unfolded itself before him was typical. The table overloaded, the women overdressed. The luncheon was already in full course when he came. He mumbled an apology and seated himself on the only remaining chair next to a youth who reminded him of a well-dressed dummy. With slight weariness, his eyes wandered in all directions for more congenial faces, when they were arrested by a lady on the opposite side of the table. She was clad in a silk robe with curiously embroidered network that revealed a nervous and delicate throat. The rich effect of the network was relieved by the studied simplicity with which her heavy chestnut-colored hair was gathered in a single knot. Her face was turned away from him, but there was something in the carriage of her head that struck him as familiar. When at last she looked him in the face, the glass almost fell from his hand. It was Ethel Bradenberg. She seemed to notice his embarrassment and smiled. When she opened her lips to speak, he knew by the haunting sweetness of the voice that he was not mistaken. "Tell me," she said wistfully, "you have forgotten me?" "They all have." He hastened to assure her that he had not forgotten her. He recollected now that he had first been introduced to her in Walcomb's house some years ago, when, a mere college boy, he had been privileged to attend one of that master's famous receptions. She had looked quite resolute and happy then, not at all like the woman who stared so strangely at Reginald in the Broadway restaurant. He regarded this encounter as very fortunate. He knew so much of her personal history that it seemed to him that they had been intimate for years. She too felt on familiar ground with him. Neither as much as whispered the name of Reginald Clark, yet it was he, and the knowledge of what he was to them, that linked their souls with a common bond. Okay, that was a whole chapter. Now we're on to chapter 14. It was the third day after their meeting. Hour by hour their intimacy had increased. Ethel was sitting in a large wicker chair. She restlessly fingered her parasol, mechanically describing magic circles in the sand. Ernest lay at her feet. With his knees clasped between his hands, he gazed into her eyes. "Why are you trying so hard to make love to me?" the woman asked, with the half-amused smile with which the Eve near 30 receives the homage of a boy. There is an element of insincerity in that smile, but it is a weapon of defense against love's artillery. Sometimes, indeed, the pleading in the boy's eyes and the cry of the blood pierces the woman's smiling superiority. She listens, loves, and loses. Ethel Brandenburg was listening, but the idea of love had not yet entered into her mind. Her interest in Ernest was due in part to his youth and the trembling in his voice when he spoke of love. But what probably attracted her most powerfully was the fact that he intimately knew the man who still held her woman's hearts in the hollow of his hand. It was half in play, therefore, that she had asked him that question. Why did he make love to her? He did not know. Perhaps it was the irresistible desire to be petted, which young poets share with domesticated cats. But what should he tell her? Polite platitudes were out of place between them. Besides, he knew the penalty of all tender entanglements. Women treat love as if it were an extremely tenuous wire that can be drawn out indefinitely. This is a very expensive process. It cost us the most precious, the only irretrievable thing in the universe, time. And to him, time was a song. For money he did not care. The Lord had hallowed his lips with rhythmic speech. Only in intervals of his singing might he listen to the voice of his heart, strangest of all watches, that tells time not by minutes and hours, but by the coming and going of love. The woman beside him seemed to read his thoughts. "Child, child," she said, "why will you toy with love? Like Jehovah, he is a jealous God, and nothing but the whole heart can placate him. Woe to the woman who takes a poet for a lover. I admit it is fascinating, but it is playing va banque. In fact, it is fatal. Art or love will come to harm. No man can minister equally to both. A genuine poet is incapable of loving a woman." "Pshaw, you exaggerate. Of course there is a measure of truth in what you say, but it is only one side of the truth, and the truth, as you know, is always Janus-faced. In fact, it often has more than two faces. I can assure you that I have cared deeply for the women to whom my love poetry was written, and you will not deny that it is genuine." "God forbid. Only you have been using the wrong preposition. You should have said it was written at them." Ernest stared at her in childlike wonder. "By Jove, you are too devilishly clever," he exclaimed. After a little silence, he said, not without hesitation, "And do you apply your theory to all artists, or only to us makers of rhyme?" "To all," she replied. He looked at her questioningly. "Yes," she said, with a new sadness in her voice, "I too have paid the price." "You mean?" "I loved. And art. That was the sacrifice." "Perhaps you have chosen the better part," Ernest said without conviction. "No," she replied, "my tribute was bought in vain." This she said calmly, but Ernest knew that her words were of tragic import. You love him still?" he observed simply. Ethel made no reply. Sadness clouded her face like a veil, or like a gray mist over the face of the waters. Her eyes went out to sea, following the somber flight of the sea mews. In that moment he could have taken her in his arms and kissed her with infinite tenderness. But tenderness between a man and a woman is like a match in a powder magazine. The least provocation, and an amorous explosion will ensue, tumbling down the card houses of platonic affection. If he yielded to the impulse of the moment, the wine of the springtide would set their blood afire, and from the flames within us there is no escape. "Come, come," she said, "you do not love me." He protested. "Ah," she cried triumphantly, "how many sonnets would you give for me?" "Oh, excuse me." "If you were a usurer in gold instead of in rhyme, I would ask how many dollars. But it is unjust to pay in a coin that we value little. To a man starving in gold mines, a piece of bread weighs more than all the treasures of the earth. To you, I warrant, your poems are the standard of appreciation. How many would you give for me? 1, 2, 3, more? Because you think love would repay you with compound interest," she observed merrily. He laughed. And when love turns to laughter, the danger is past for the moment. All right, chapter 15. Thus, 3 weeks passed without apparent change in their relations. Ernest possessed a personal magnetism that, always emanating from him, was felt most deeply when withdrawn. He was at all times involuntarily exerting his power, which she ever resisted, always on the alert, always warding off. When at last pressure of work made his immediate departure for New York imperative, he had not apparently gained the least ground, but Ethel knew in her heart that she was fascinated, if not in love. The personal fascination was supplemented by a motherly feeling towards Ernest that, sensuous in essence, was itself not far removed from love. She struggled bravely and with external success against her emotions, never losing sight of the fact that 20 and 30 are 50. Increasingly aware of her own weaknesses, she constantly attempted to lead the conversation into impersonal channels, speaking preferably of his work. "Tell me," she said, negligently fanning herself, "what new inspiration have you drawn from your stay at the seaside?" "Why," he explained enthusiastically, "volumes and volumes of it. I shall write the great novel of my life after I am once more quietly installed at Riverside Drive." "The great American novel?" she rejoined. "Perhaps. Who will be your hero? Clark?" There was a slight touch of malice in her words, or rather in the pause between the penultimate word and the last. Ernest detected its presence, and she knew that her love for Reginald was dead. Stiff and cold it lay in her heart's chamber. Besides, how many others, all emboxed in the coffin of memory? No, he replied, after a while, a little piqued by her suggestion. Clark is not the hero. What makes you think that he cast a spell on everything I do? Dear child, she replied, I know him. He cannot fail to impress his powerful personality upon all with whom he comes in contact, to the injury of their intellectual independence. Moreover, he is so brilliant and says everything so much better than everybody else, that by his splendor he discourages effort in others. At best, his influence will shape your development according to the tenets of his mind, curious, subtle, and corrupted. You will become mentally distorted, like one of those hunchbacked Japanese trees, infinitely wrinkled and indefinitely grotesque, whose laws of growth are not determined by nature, but by the diseased imagination of the East. I am no weakling, Ernest asserted, and your picture of Clark is altogether out of perspective. His splendid successes are to me a source of constant inspiration. We have some things in common, but I realize that it is along entirely different lines that success will come to me. He has never sought to influence me. In fact, I never received the smallest suggestion from him. Here the Princess Marigold seemed to peer at him through the veil of the past, but he waved her aside. As for my story, he continued, you need not go so far out of your way to find the leading character. Who can it be? Ethel remarked with a merry twinkle. You? Ethel, he said sulkingly, be serious. You know that it is you. I am immensely flattered, she replied. Really, nothing pleases me better than to be immortalized in print, since I have little hope nowadays of perpetuating my name by virtue of pencil or brush. I have been put into the novels before, and I am consumed with curiosity to hear the plot of yours. If you don't mind, I'd rather not tell you just yet, Ernest said. It's going to be called Leontina. That's you. But all depends on the treatment. You know, it doesn't matter much what you say so long as you say it well. That's what counts. At any rate, any indication of the plot at this stage would be decidedly inadequate. I think you are right, she ventured. By all means, choose your own time to tell me. Let's talk of something else. Have you written anything since your delightful book of verse last spring? Surely now is your singing season. By the time we are 30, the springs of pure lyric passion are usually exhausted. Ethel's inquiry somehow startled him. In truth, he could find no satisfactory answer. A remark relative to his play, Clark's play, rose to the threshold of his lips, but he almost bit his tongue as soon as he realized that the strange delusion that had possessed him that night still dominated the undercurrents of his cerebration. No, he had accomplished but little during the last few months, at least by way of creative literature. So he replied that he had made money. That is something, he said. Besides, who can turn out a masterpiece every week? An artist's brain is not a machine, and in the respite from creative work I have gathered strength for the future. But, he added, slightly annoyed, you were not listening. His exclamation brought her back from the train of thoughts that his words had suggested. For in his reasoning she had recognized the same arguments that she had hourly repeated to herself in defense of her inactivity when she was living under the baneful influence of Reginald Clark. Yes, baneful. For the first time she dared to confess it to herself. In a flash, the truth dawned upon her that it was not her love alone, but something else, something irresistible and very mysterious that had dried up the well of creation in her. Could it be that the same power was now exerting its influence on the struggling soul of this talented boy? Rack her brains as she might, she could not definitely formulate her apprehensions, and a troubled look came into her eyes. Ethel, the boy repeated impatiently, why are you not listening? Do you realize that I must leave you in half an hour? She looked at him with deep tenderness. Something like a tear lent soft radiance to her large, childlike eyes. Ernest saw it. Excuse me. Ernest saw it and was profoundly Ernest saw it and was profoundly moved. In that moment, he loved her passionately. Foolish boy, she said softly, then lowering her voice to a whisper, you may kiss me before you go. His lips gently touched hers, but she took his head between her hands and pressed her mouth upon his in a long kiss. Ernest drew back a little, awkwardly. He had not been kissed like this before. Poet though you are, Ethel whispered, you have not yet learned to kiss. She was deeply agitated when she noticed that his hand was fumbling for the watch in his vest pocket. She suddenly released him and said, a little hurt, no, you must not miss your train. Go by all means. Vainly, Ernest remonstrated with her. Go to him, she said, and again, go to him. With a heavy heart, the boy obeyed. He waved his hat to her once more from below, and then rapidly disappeared into the crowd. For the moment, strange misgivings cramped her heart, and something within her called out to him. Do not go, do not return to that house. But no sound issued from her lips. Worldly wisdom had sealed them, had stifled their inner voice, and soon the boy's golden head was swallowed up in the distance. You know, I'm going to go ahead and stop now. I think we're at a good breaking point. I am going to editorialize for just a second. It's not very homoerotic, and I'm sorry about that. We are going to finish the book, and I will promise, just so we can get to something a little more traditional, that I will find something a little bit more just in the regular great homoeroticism. Just something, we'll go a little more hardcore on the next book. I promise you that. We'll have more fun with that. But I appreciate everybody sticking with me. We are going to finish this book up at some point. We're just going to keep going till it's done. I'm going to stop tonight. I'm tired. It is bedtime for Bruce. And you have been watching me on bedtimewithbruce.com. And I am so grateful that you're all here. Thank you so much for coming by to visit me tonight. Please drop us a line if you'd like. Make comments, suggestions, questions. Right now we're at bedtimewithbruce@gmail.com. And you can also check us out. There's always going to be new information and things to look at www.bedtimewithbruce.com. Thank you so much for stopping in. I hope to see you next time. Good night.